For 8 years, I was the person they trusted with everything that couldn't go wrong. So when the lead operations role opened up, nobody acted surprised that it would be mine. My own manager told me, more than once, that it was basically already decided. Then the reorg email went out, and someone else's name was in the seat. I was told the timing wasn't right. Maybe next cycle. I was disappointed, but I believed it because I trusted the people who said it. Months later, a tuition form needed a copy of my own personnel file. I never actually read it, so while it sat on my desk, I opened it. The way you flip through something you assume holds no surprises. There was a line in it I had never seen before. Employee declined to be considered for the lead operations role. Personal reasons. Dated the same week the new lead was announced. I read it 3 times because I never declined anything. There was no meeting, no form, no conversation. I was never even asked. So who decided I had said no? And why did they need it in writing? Let me back up, because that line only matters if you understand who I was before it appeared in my file. I ran operations for a mid-sized distribution company. Schedules, staffing, the 1,000 small fires that never make it into a quarterly report, but would burn the place down if nobody put them out. 8 years. I started as a coordinator and worked my way up to senior team lead. And somewhere along the way, I became the person other people came to when they didn't know who else to ask. I wasn't flashy. I was reliable. In a building full of people who wanted credit, I was the one who wanted the thing to actually work. I liked it that way. I told myself that good work was its own kind of resume, that if you were genuinely the best person for the next role, the system would eventually notice. I believed in the process, the postings, the interviews, the evaluations, the careful HR language about fairness and consideration. I believed it because it had always seemed to run straight, and because I never had a reason to look behind it, and I trusted the people inside it. My manager, Betrayal, had been there longer than I had. He was the kind of manager who remembered your kids' names and asked about your weekend and minute. Mostly, when the lead operations role started coming up in conversation, he was the one who first put it in my head. That's basically yours, he told me once, leaning on the edge of my desk like we were old friends. Just keep doing what you're doing. I did keep doing what I was doing. I assumed he was telling me the truth, because for 8 years he mostly had. So when the reorganization announcement came, I read it twice before it registered. The lead operations role had been filled by someone named in the same paragraph that announced it, a transfer from our other site, a man I had never worked beside for a single day. There had been no posting I'd seen, no interview I'd sat. The role I'd been told was basically mine had simply appeared in someone else's hands, finished, like a deal that had closed in a room I was never in. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm anyone's office. I told myself there must be a reason. I waited a respectful day, and then I asked Betrayal if we could talk. He was warm about it, which somehow made it worse. He said the timing wasn't right. He said the other candidate brought cross-site experience the company needed right now. He said there'd be another cycle, and that I should be patient, that my time would come. I nodded through all of it, the way you nod when someone you trust is telling you something that mostly sounds reasonable. And then he said the thing that didn't fit, the small wrong note I couldn't stop replaying for days afterward. We understand your situation, he said. Nobody holds it against you. My situation. I didn't have a situation. I drove home that night, turning the phrase over like a stone in my pocket. There was no situation, no leave I'd taken, no family emergency, no quiet conversation where I'd asked for less. I had wanted that role. I had said so more than once to him. So what situation was he being so understanding about? I almost let it go. That's the part one think about most now. How close I came to filing it under office politics and moving on, the way you do with 100 small slides that aren't worth the cost of carrying. But the more I sat with it, the more one fact refused to settle. If the timing was simply wrong, why reference a personal situation that didn't exist? You don't accidentally invent someone's circumstances. You reach for them when you need an explanation that sounds gentle. And then a smaller thing surfaced, the kind of detail that only matters in hindsight. In all those months of "it's basically yours," I had never once been formally asked. No application. No interview. No moment where someone said, "Are you putting your name in for this?" The promotion had been discussed around me, near me, at me, but never actually offered to me in any way I could have accepted or declined. It had just hovered, and then it was gone. I didn't know yet what that meant. But the question had a hook in me now, and it wouldn't shake loose. A few weeks later, something ordinary gave me the thread. I'd signed up for a certification course, and the tuition reimbursement form needed a copy of my own personnel file attached. Standard stuff, a box to check, a document to pull. I went to HR, and a generalist named Priya printed it for me without a second thought. It was just paperwork. I almost folded it into my bag unread. But I'm the kind of person who reads things. 8 years of catching other people's errors will do that to you. So I sat down with my own file, the way I'd read 100 schedules and staffing reports, and I went through it line by line. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Hire date, title changes, a couple of commendations, the dry record of steady career. And then, in the section that logged role and status changes, I found a single entry I had never seen and had certainly never authorized. Employee declined to be considered for the lead operations role. Personal reasons. The date was the week of the reorganization, the week the transfer got the seat. I read it again, then a third time, slower, because part of me was sure I was misreading it, the way I always assume I'm the one who made the mistake. But the words didn't change. According to my own personnel file, the official permanent record of my career, I had withdrawn myself from the role. I had taken my own name out of the running for personal reasons. I had done no such thing. There was no conversation where I declined, no email where I stepped back, no form I signed, no meeting where I said the words. I had wanted that role and said so out loud to the very manager who told me it was mine. And somewhere in this building, someone had written down that I'd walked away from it and made it look like my own decision. That was the moment the disappointment turned into something colder and more useful. Because a timing problem is an opinion. You can argue about timing forever. What declined is a claim about something I did. It's a fact, or it's a lie, and there is no third option. And this one was a lie sitting in ink in my own file. I made myself slow down. One line could be an error, a miskeyed entry, a confusion with someone else's record, a clumsy shorthand for "we went another direction." I had spent a career refusing to call a single data point a conspiracy, and I wasn't going to start now. But errors have a shape, and this one didn't have it, because the entry had an author field. Every change in that system does. And when I looked at who had entered the note, I recognized the authorization initials. It had gone in under Bractal. I sat with that for a long time. Not the HR clerk, not some faceless system glitch. The entry tracked back to the manager who had told me the role was basically mine, and then told me my situation was understood. The note hadn't appeared from nowhere. Someone with the authority to shape my record had reached into it and written that I'd said no. And I started to understand why that particular word, declined, is a beautiful word if you need one. It doesn't say we passed her over. It doesn't say we gave it to someone we'd already chosen. It says the candidate removed herself, respectfully, for reasons of her own that no one need examine. It turns a skipped step into a dignified choice. On paper, a promotion process where the obvious internal candidate declined looks completely fair. Nobody was wronged. She simply bowed out. I realized, the cleanest possible way to make a decided outcome look like an open one. But I held the line with myself. One note authorized by one manager is favoritism at worst, a single bad act at most. If I was going to believe what I was starting to believe, that this was a method and not a moment, I needed more than my own grievance dressed up as analysis. I needed to know if it had happened to anyone else. So I thought about who else had been close to a role and somehow ended up beside it instead of in it. And I remembered Marcus. Marcus had been a team lead in a different department, sharp and well-liked, the kind of person everyone assumed was next in line for a supervisor opening 2 cycles back. He hadn't gotten it. He'd grown quiet after that, then frustrated, and within a year he'd left for a competitor. At the time, the story that went around, the story I'd half believed, was that Marcus had gotten passed over and couldn't take it, that he wasn't quite as ready as he thought. I felt a little sorry for him and moved on. I reached out carefully. I didn't lead him. I just asked whether he'd ever actually looked at his own personnel file before he left. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause where someone is deciding whether to reopen an old wound. Then he said yes. He'd pulled it once, near the end, when he was angry enough to want a paper trail of his own. I asked him if he remembered what it said about the supervisor role. It said I declined to be considered, he told me. And then, quieter, I never declined. I just figured I wasn't good enough, and they let me keep thinking that. I asked him a question I'd already learned to ask. Was there a signed form anywhere? Anything he'd put his name to? Stepping back? He was quiet for a second, then said no, there'd been nothing. No meeting, no email, no paper. Just the note, sitting in his file like it had always been true, like a verdict he'd never been told was being entered. The same phrase, declined to be considered. The same lie, in a different file, in a different department 2 cycles apart. And the same terrible after effect. A capable person who'd spent a year believing he simply hadn't measured up, when the truth was that someone had quietly closed the door and labeled it from the inside. I didn't sleep much that night, but I wasn't grieving anymore. I was counting. Within a couple of weeks, asking the kind of careful questions you ask when you don't want to sound like you're building a case, I found the 3rd one. A woman in logistics, strong candidate for a lead role the year before, who'd been told the timing wasn't right and had transferred to another department rather than wait around. I never saw her file. I had no right to, but the shape of her story was identical, down to the gentle language and the sudden, finished outcome. 3 strong internal candidates. 3 roles that went to outside transfers or pre-favored hires. And in at least 2 files confirmed the same word doing the same quiet work. Declined. That was the moment the whole thing turned over in my head and stopped being about me. Because here's what I finally understood, and it's the part that still sits uncomfortably, not because it's monstrous, but because it's so ordinary. Bractal hadn't built a conspiracy. There was no secret war against internal staff, no villain rubbing his hands. What there was, I'm fairly sure, was a series of promises. A transfer he'd committed to bringing over. A favored hire he'd told, somewhere, that a role was waiting. Maybe pressure from the other side, maybe a handshake deal, maybe just the ordinary politics of a manager spending goodwill he'd already promised away. And once you've promised a role to someone, the internal candidates become a problem. Not because they're bad, because they're good. A strong internal frontrunner who gets passed over might ask questions, might file something, might make the process look exactly like what it was. But a strong internal candidate who declined, that candidate is no problem at all. The process stays clean. The audit, if anyone ever ran one, shows a fair and open competition that the obvious choice simply opted out of. Declined wasn't cruelty. It was tidiness. It was the smoothest way to keep a decided thing looking open and to keep 3 capable people quietly blaming themselves instead of asking who'd written them out. I understood it. That was the worst part. I didn't hate him so much as I understood him, the way you understand a man who takes the only door that keeps everyone comfortable, including himself. Understanding it didn't make it right. It just made it real. But understanding the why led me straight to a harder question, the one I'd been avoiding. A note like that doesn't just float into a file. Someone in HR had to accept it, process it, file it as routine. which meant the process I trusted, the careful, fair-sounding machinery of consideration, had quietly waved all three of them through. So I went back to what I knew how to do. I read the policy. Our own HR handbook, the one every employee signs off on, had a specific rule for exactly this situation. When an employee withdraws from consideration for a posted role, the file is supposed to contain a signed declination, an actual form acknowledged by the employee documenting the choice. It wasn't optional. It was the safeguard that kept decline from meaning whatever a manager needed it to mean. I asked, through the right channels, a simple question. Was there a signed declination form in my file? There wasn't. There was the note. There was no form. I want to be precise about what that meant, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. The note and the form are supposed to be a pair. The note is the summary, 3 lines in a system, easy to type, easy to attribute to anyone. The form is the proof, a physical thing with the employee's own signature, the one piece of paper that can't be authored by someone else. Policy required both deliberately so that no one could ever record a withdrawal that hadn't actually happened. Removing the form didn't just skip a step. It removed the only part of the record that I couldn't have been talked into. What was left was a claim about my own choice that I had never touched. And when I thought about Marcus and the woman in logistics, I understood that a missing form is not an opinion. It's not a matter of interpretation or office politics or he said, she said. It's a gap, a required document that policy says must exist and doesn't. 3 times over if the pattern held. That was something I could prove without ever raising my voice. I sat with Priya, the generalist who'd printed my file, and I asked her gently how a declination note gets entered. She got uncomfortable fast, and I didn't push because I could see it land on her the way it had landed on me. She'd processed the entry. She hadn't checked for the form. Nobody had told her to. That was the realism of it. The damage wasn't done by a mastermind. It was done by a manager who knew exactly what he was writing, in a process full of decent people who never thought to ask whether the paper underneath the note actually existed. So I stopped being a victim of the file and went back to being someone who reads them. I gathered what I could legitimately gather, my own file, the policy language, Marcus's account in his own words, the documented absence of the required forms, and I built it into one clean packet. No accusations, no adjectives, just the policy and the gap between what it required and what the records held. I asked Bractal for one meeting first. I owed him that, and I owed myself the chance to be wrong. I laid 2 pages in front of him, the note in my file, and the policy that said a signed form should sit beside it. I watched him read, and I watched him do the thing that told me everything. He didn't argue that I had declined. He couldn't. We both knew I hadn't. Instead, he reached for the edges. HR handles the wording, he said. These things get summarized. You'd have gotten a role eventually, he said, if you'd just been patient. Every sentence was a small door closing, and every closed door pointed at the same thing. The language existed because someone had needed it to, and that someone wasn't me. When I left his office, I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided. I took the packet to HR compliance, not to a lawyer first, not to a screaming match, not to a mass email, to the one part of the company built to do exactly what I'd been doing alone at my kitchen table. Check whether the records said what people claimed they said and whether the required paper actually existed. I won't pretend it was dramatic. There was no confession, no manager marched out by security. There almost never is. What there was a review. Compliance pulled the files they were allowed to pull. They looked for the signed declination forms that policy required. And they found what I'd found, notes that said decline to be considered, and no forms to support a single one of them. The safeguard had been skipped the same way, more than once, in roles that all traced back to the same set of pre-promised outcomes. The findings were quiet and they were serious. Personnel entries had been recorded as employee decisions without the documentation that made them legitimate, which, in plain language, meant the record had been falsified, however gently, however tidily. Bractal was placed under review and moved off any role with authority over promotions and personnel records. And the part I'm most proud of, the part that will outlast all of us, the company changed the rule. A decline to be considered note could no longer be entered on a manager's say-so. It now required a signed, employee-acknowledged form on file before the entry could exist at all. You could no longer write that someone had walked away unless they'd actually signed their name to it. Compliance asked to meet with me near the end. For one foolish second, I thought they were going to hand me the lead role. They didn't. It was filled. The transfer was a year into it by then, and unwinding that wasn't on the table. What they offered instead was the truth in writing. The false note was struck from my file and replaced with an accurate record of what had actually happened. My candidacy for the next cycle was formally acknowledged in a document I could actually see, and from someone fairly senior, an apology that I could tell cost something to give. I sat with whether that was a win. It's a strange kind of victory, the one where you're proven right and still didn't get the job. The role was gone. The year of self-doubt was gone. I wasn't going to walk back into the version of my career where the promotion had simply been mine. But here's what I got, and it turned out to be the thing I actually needed. I got my own record back. For months, I'd carried the quiet idea that maybe I'd misread the whole thing, that maybe I really had been too comfortable, not quite ready, easy to pass over. The file answered that, finally and completely. I hadn't declined anything. I hadn't removed myself. I've been written out in one clean line by someone who needed the process to look like something it wasn't. My worth was never the question. My convenience was. Marcus called me after it was over. He'd heard the way people hear. He didn't say much. He just said that for a year he believed he wasn't good enough, and that knowing the truth, even late, had loosened something he'd been carrying. I told him I knew exactly what he meant. We didn't need anyone to fall on a sword. We just needed the record to stop lying about us. Priya reached out once too, a short message that said she should have checked and that she was sorry she hadn't. I believed her. I didn't need her ruined. I needed her to say out loud that the form should have been there and she'd let it slide. She did. That was enough to set it down. I still work in operations. Different responsibilities now, a little more reach, and a habit I'll never lose. I read the files, all of them, including now and then my own. People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter about how it went, and I tell them the truth, which is that bitterness assumes they took something real from me, and what they took was never as real as the version in my head. They didn't take my worth. They couldn't. It was sitting right there in 8 years of work that no quiet note could erase. Here's the thing about a record. People can write that you walked away. They can choose the gentlest possible word and file it where they assume no one will ever look. They can make a closed-door read like a respectful choice for exactly as long as the person it was written about never opens their own file. But a record can only say you declined. It can't make it true. And only one person actually knows whether you were ever asked to stay. I know, because for 8 years, I was the one who read everyone else's records carefully. The day I finally read my own, it told me who they thought I was, someone who would never look. They were wrong about that. I sleep fine now.